Hey, how's it going, folks? I hope everybody had a really good Valentine's Day and spent some quality time with their significant other. And even if you don't have a significant other, I hope you guys at least found some inspiration in your journey to acquire one, if indeed that's your goal at all. So, when I create these videos, usually the first thing that happens that I'll get a lot of people asking me about hair loss, and what they'll ask specifically is, I'm new to this all. I just discovered your videos. I've just looked into research regarding male pattern baldness, and I don't even know where to begin. And what I'll usually tell them is, first, I'll tell them, speak with your doctor. I'm not a doctor. I'm just sharing my personal experiences with these treatments I've used in the past. And what I tell them to ask their doctor about is ask them about finasteride. And I highly recommend finasteride as a starting ground for everybody who's fighting male pattern baldness. And the sooner they start, the better. And the reason why is because finasteride is a proven treatment. It's a good value. It's convenient. It's safe. The risk of side effects are extremely low. And despite some of the persistent claims from naysayers and doomsayers that it ruined their life, there is no evidence-based data whatsoever that finasteride has persistent or irreversible side effects. It does have a risk of side effects, of course, just like any drug, but the risk of side effects are low. It's anywhere from like 2 to 3.8%, depending on which studies you read. And the side effects absolutely do go away after discontinuation. I mean, the claims that they're permanent is just absolutely ludicrous, because if they were permanent, the people who get these side effects, they would also be able to keep their hair, but you'll notice that they actually lose their hair when they stop using the drug. So you'd think if it causes all these other permanent side effects, then it would at least allow them to keep the one beneficial thing that finasteride causes, which is hair growth. But because of these horror stories, unfortunately, a lot of people will seek out other treatments, and a lot of these treatments don't work. They're overly theoretical, they're experimental, and maybe they do work, but they're not as good. They have a higher risk of side effects, and they're just not sustainable for long term use. So, I want to go over some of those treatments that I've been asked about, these overhyped treatments for hair loss that either don't work at all, don't work very well, or just come with too big of a risk. I've been asked about a lot of them. Some of them I've actually covered already, like azelaic acid and oral minoxidil. So if you're curious about my opinion on those, I do have videos covering that. So you can go ahead and just check my video history. And I recommend you watch those videos if you're interested. But I want to go over some of the treatments that I have not talked about yet in my videos. So without any further ado, let's go over them. So the first one is spironolactone, and I'm talking about both the oral and topical variation of these drugs. So, this one's really sad because spironolactone is something that is not suitable for male consumption, I should say. I mean, the only reason why a man would want to take oral spironolactone is if they were interested in transitioning into a woman. And I have nothing against that. I mean, if people want to do that, that's their business. People are free to do what they want with their body. However, a lot of men out of desperation will seek extreme treatments like spironolactone. And these are the people who obviously are not afraid of finasteride, because if they're taking something like spironolactone, then you don't care about the side effects of finasteride. And what's really sad is that what they'll do is that they'll start something like finasteride, and then they'll like wait like a few weeks, and they'll get like a shed, that initial shed that oftentimes happens when you begin a new hair loss treatment. And they'll just jump to the conclusion that it's not working without realizing that the initial shed is a sign that the treatment is working. Granted, not everybody gets it, but what happens when you begin a new hair loss treatment is that it accelerates the anagen phase of the hair follicle, and that can cause some premature shedding. But what's happening is that the hair follicle is making room for newer, stronger hair. So it's very important not to panic about the initial shed. However, some people do panic about the initial shed, and they'll say, okay, finasteride isn't strong enough, and maybe they'll upgrade to dutasteride, or furthermore, they'll go even farther than that, and they'll say, all right, I'm going to use spironolactone. Now, interestingly enough, even though it is used by male to female trans women, spironolactone is actually a pretty weak anti-androgen at small doses, and it's used more as a diuretic. In fact, interestingly enough, almost paradoxically, a lot of bodybuilders will use it to reduce water retention, just because it causes them to pee a lot more. That's a common side effect. But they'll use small doses, like 25 to 50 milligrams per day. And the problem is that you're not really going to get any anti-androgen effect at that dose. So even if you are using it with the goal of lowering your androgens, it's not really going to do much unless you use it at large doses. So at large doses, it does in fact work as an anti-androgen. However, it doesn't just target dihydrotestosterone, DHT. It targets testosterone, and that of course will put a man's virility at risk and put them at risk of feminization. And that's the reason why it's used by male to female trans women to transition, and the doses they use are at least 100 milligrams, because anything lower than 100 milligrams will probably not be effective. And that's not what's ever prescribed to trans women who are transitioning. So it's not going to be effective for men who are trying to lower their androgen levels to fight male pattern baldness. So another thing to keep in mind is that even male to female trans women who do take spironolactone will sometimes still experience male pattern baldness. So they'll still take an alpha 5 reductase inhibitor like finasteride, because when your testosterone lowers, an interesting effect is that it will cause an upregulation of alpha 5 reductase activity on the scalp. And because of that, there will still be a lot of DHT there, and that can cause hair loss in people who suppress their testosterone. And that's why some men, not all, but some men who go on TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, one of the side effects that they report is actually hair growth. Although some people also report hair loss as well, because eventually, if your testosterone level is really high, like if you're using steroids, there'll just be too much of it. Too much of it will convert to DHT, even if there's not very much alpha 5 reductase activity on the scalp. And also, testosterone itself, while not nearly as bad as DHT, still has a slight necrotic effect on the hair follicle. And there are some studies, however, I want to point out, that show that oral spironolactone has been somewhat effective in treating female pattern baldness. And and that's important because, actually female pattern baldness can be caused by androgens as well. It's just that women, that this very small amount of androgens that they produce in some cases is enough to cause a hair loss in them. However, in the study I found, and I'm going to link all these studies before, the women were using an extremely high dosage, like 200 milligrams per day, certainly something higher than any man who wants to remain a man should take. And even still, fewer than half the participants in the study had any regrowth at all, and this was like a few hundred people, so it was a pretty significant clinical trial, and this was after 12 months, so this is like, enough time to determine whether or not the drug is effective. And it's also important to note in terms of female pattern baldness that, even though spironolactone, there are some studies showing that it might be somewhat effective, that there might be some detrimental effects to suppressing your testosterone dramatically, because, even though testosterone is the main male hormone, testosterone still does play an important role in women for maintaining sexual health as well as skeletal muscular health. So, suppression of testosterone in extreme degrees can have libidinous side effects and cause muscle wastage, sarcopenia. And so, that's why sometimes women will use a small amount of testosterone if they have libidinous issues, just a small enough so that they can increase their libido without having any kind of virilizing side effects like, facial hair growth, or like deepening the voice, things that don't, clitoral enlargement, those kind of things. So I've actually used topical spironolactone before. I would never touch oral spironolactone, of course, but I remember Dr. Lee, and Dr. Lee was a doctor who sold a whole bunch of like online remedies. Some of them BS, some of them were effective, but some of them were not. And he had a formula of topical spironolactone that I used, and I used it for about a solid year or so, and it didn't really do anything. And a lot of the hype behind oral spironolactone eventually died off. And I don't think there are any solutions available today except for the S5 cream, which I think is you can buy from one retailer. And I've used that one before too. And it's really unpleasant. It's this really thick cream, and it smells like condoms mixed with lemon juice, and it makes the hair sticky so it stands up, kind of like that scene from Something About Mary. So it doesn't have a good cosmetic effect. It doesn't smell very good, and there's no real evidence that topical spironolactone is useful for hair loss. In fact, there are some studies that show it might be effective for acne, but there's studies that even have the participants like basically covering half their body in topical spironolactone, and it showed almost no change in their serum DHT or androgen levels where it was applied. So if you want to go for a topical anti-androgen, a much better choice would be something like alpha-tretdiol, which isn't as strong as RU58841 or CB0301, but they're not. It's not experimental, at least. It's more readily available. And another one which actually is harder to acquire because it's only available in, I think it might only be available in the Czech Republic, actually, is Fluridil, which chemically is similar to topical flutamide. And topical flutamide is something I've used before in the past. I don't recommend it. It gave me side effects, but Fluridil isn't quite the same thing, and it's a pretty effective topical anti-androgen. I'd say it's about on par with alpha-tretdiol, but it's harder to acquire, probably a lot more expensive. So I'd probably just stick with alpha-tretdiol if you want to start with like an entry-level topical anti-androgen. So anyways, moving on to the next one is saw palmetto. So there have been clinical trials done on saw palmetto that show it is effective in reducing prostate size. And we know that enlarged prostate is caused by the same chemical in the body that causes hair loss, which is dihydrotestosterone DHT. So one might assume that saw palmetto might work as kind of like a natural finasteride because we know that the actually specifically what happens in the prostate is that there's a lot of the type 2 of the alpha 5 reductase enzyme, and that's also present on the scalp, and that's what converts testosterone to DHT. So you might be thinking, okay, great, saw palmetto, there's a natural finasteride right there. Unfortunately, there was also a recent study that showed that saw palmetto, even at extremely large doses, was no better than placebo. So this was a follow-up study, and that kind of reflects my own experience with the drug. I used it at very large doses and I saw no benefit from it. And I used it before I used finasteride, and finasteride was tremendously beneficial for me. And the fact that I was able to use saw palmetto at large doses and not get any of the benefits that finasteride gave me just shows that, at least in my experience, finasteride is significantly better. And the study had 250 men, and they were aged over 50, and none of them experienced any improvement in prostate health even after a year of usage. And you may be thinking, okay, well that's for the prostate, not the scalp. But here's the thing to keep in mind. Like I said, drugs like finasterides and herbs like saw palmetto are not direct DHT inhibitors. They are alpha 5 reductase inhibitors, and finasteride inhibits the type 2 alpha 5 reductase enzyme, which is most present on the prostate. It is also most present on the scalp, and that is why treatments like finasteride are approved both for enlarged prostate and for male pattern baldness. So, and also I would also add that even if saw palmetto did work, it would not be side effect free. I mean, don't be an appeal to nature idiot and assume that just because something is natural, that means there is no risk of side effects. I mean, nature is what is making you go bald in the first place. So, if you're putting your faith in nature, when nature is fighting against you, then you're a damn fool who needs to realize that nature is not something to acquiesce and submit to. Nature is something to be conquered. And if you really like nature that much, then just go bald because that's what nature wants of you. But in my case, nature can go to hell. I want hair, not nature. So, anyways, moving on to the next treatment that I think is overrated and doesn't really work is peppermint oil. This one's pretty interesting because there's at least several sizable studies, in vitro rodent studies, and the studies are limited to just in vitro studies like the rodent studies. And we know that these studies don't necessarily produce the same results in human organisms. Like, I think a very common example of that would be saccharin. Saccharin is a common artificial sweetener, and it's been shown to actually cause cancer in rodents, but it doesn't cause cancer in humans. Otherwise, it never would have been on the market. So that doesn't mean it's bunk, but even if there is a small chance that peppermint oil might help with hair growth, I mean, why bother with it when there are so many other treatments we know that work and have millions of dollars of clinical research backing up their efficacy? And also, peppermint oil is not side effect free from what I researched. It can cause skin irritation, particularly in high doses used for treating scalp hair loss, which would you need to do if you want to get full scalp coverage. Like me personally, I use 6 milliliters of minoxidil per day because that's what I need for full scalp coverage. And that may not be essential, but for me, I mean, I have a pretty big head, and I like to get like every little square centimeter on the top of my head and the front of my scalp. And I find that 6 milliliters for topicals, whether it be minoxidil, stamoxidine, alpha is ideal for getting that full scalp coverage. So, I don't want to necessarily discourage people from trying new things. I mean, if they want to try to treat themselves as human guinea pigs, that is their business. But when it comes to hair loss, time is of the essence, and you may not get a second chance to save your hair if you waste too much time with unproven treatments that are just theoretical at this point. So I would recommend sticking with what we know works. But if you're feeling adventurous, by all means, I'd be curious to hear what your results are, quite frankly. So, moving on to number 4, I want to go ahead and talk about shampoos marketed towards hair loss. Now, this is something I've covered in my videos before. However, I think it's important to address it again just because I get asked about it so frequently that I don't want to leave anybody confused. So, as we all know, hair loss is a huge scam industry, possibly the biggest scam industry that has ever existed. And it's been exploited by grifters, charlatans, con artists trying to scam people out of their money for hundreds if not thousands of years. And they do so by appealing to their sense of desperation and ignorance with appealingly marketed snake oils. And these snake oils, they still exist today. They just have different logos, they have different names. We're talking about names like Nioxin, like Revivogen, the Helsinki formula, Alpacin, just to name a few. And guess what? None of these work, because even if the active ingredients did have some science behind them, and sometimes they do, it doesn't matter, because a shampoo is not going to stay on the scalp long enough for it to effectively penetrate. So to give you an example, minoxidil, which is the first FDA approved treatment for male pattern baldness, it's recommended that it stays on the scalp for 4 hours for ideal scalp penetration. And maybe you can get away with getting a little bit less than 4 hours in. Maybe you can leave it on for just 2 hours and get most of the absorption in. However, when it comes to these shampoos, the recommendation is just 2 to 5 minutes before rinsing it off. And there's no way you're going to get very much absorption just leaving something on your scalp for 2 to 5 minutes and just rinsing it off. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So there is one shampoo that's really popular in the hair loss community called Nizoral, and it's actually a dandruff shampoo, and the active ingredient is ketoconazole. And there is one obscure Japanese study that shows that using ketoconazole with finasteride is more effective than using finasteride by itself. However, it was a pretty small sample size, and it's just one study, and it was done with 2% ketoconazole shampoo, not the over-the-counter 1% ketoconazole shampoo. So that's something to keep in mind. And if you want to use it, by all means, go ahead. I mean, we have to shower anyways. Just keep in mind that Nizoral does make the hair look kind of frizzy, makes it look pretty bad, dries it out pretty badly. All ketoconazole shampoos will do that. And additionally, if you really want to use ketoconazole as an active ingredient, I mean, it's been shown that even though it's an antifungal, it does have an anti-androgenic effect. It would probably be better just to use the Nizoral cream, because you can leave it on the scalp longer, get more benefit out of it, and it still has the same active ingredient. And I haven't really experimented with it very much, but I do have a friend who uses it and claims to have gotten good results from it. I know a couple other people have claimed to have gotten good results from it. So if I were to really go all out with experimenting on ketoconazole, I'd definitely go with the cream as opposed to the shampoo. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I don't want to get into too much detail. I mean, I have plenty of other videos covering that subject. So what I do want to talk about is something I haven't really covered, but I get asked about all the time, and that's low-level laser light therapy. So I'm talking about laser combs, laser caps, like, clinics you go to where you have like a laser bucket put on your head. And I've actually done that before, and I'll get into that a little bit later. And there's a lot of these things marketed online. I even saw an advertisement on an airplane for a laser cap. I've seen the laser comb on television infomercials, and a quick Google search will show that it seems that there actually are some positive studies regarding laser therapy. And I did a Google search, and I found several randomized control trials which suggest that low-level laser light therapy using various devices, like the laser caps, like I mentioned, laser combs, do in fact yield positive results. So that sounds great. However, these studies have been examined and found to be low quality studies. I found a follow-up study which examined these studies, and I'll just go ahead and quote it right here, and I'll also link the study in the description below. But it showed that out of the 9 trials that were identified for comb and helmet cap devices, 5 of which were randomized controlled trials, data comparison across low-level laser light therapy trials and with traditional hair loss therapy, which are minoxidil and finasteride, was not straightforward because there was a lack of visual evidence. So we didn't even have visual evidence. Sample sizes were low, and there were large variations in study duration and efficacy measurements. So you really cannot employ studies that use different measuring techniques and standards to get reliable data. You need to be able to test a group and test them again in order to get using the same testing parameters in order to yield reliable data. That's what reliability means. That means you can do it over and over again to get the same results. So in order to draw a better conclusion about this, what you would really need is a large randomized control trial with double-blind studies where both the investigators and the subjects in the study don't know if they're getting the real treatment or the placebo. I mean, that's what double-blind means. Oftentimes companies will sponsor these studies with weak evidence to manipulate people who don't have the scientific literacy to evaluate the evidence and only look at the conclusion. And they use that to basically just manipulate people into trusting their product. And I have a personal history with low-level laser light therapy. I imagine it hasn't changed that much in the decades since, because the active ingredient is light. I mean, how complicated is that going to be? But personally speaking, laser therapy was actually one of the first things that I tried when I began my hair loss journey. So this is even before I got on finasteride minoxidil. So I'm talking about well over 10 years ago. And what I did is I went to this really fancy clinic that specialized in low-level laser light therapy. and they had this like big bucket that they put on my head, and it was extremely expensive, and I used it for about a year. And even after a year of regular treatment, I didn't see a single result. Nothing. My hairline continued to recede, and I was resentful because not only did I lose a lot of money, I mean, if I had actually started on a legitimate treatment like finasteride, then, maybe I wouldn't have needed a hair transplant later in life. So I feel stupid that I fell for it because, what is the active ingredient supposed to be? Light? I mean, it's such an obvious scam. So, don't fall for it. And I'll go ahead and post that study I mentioned in the description below. So, the next thing I want to talk about is biotin. Now, biotin is just a water soluble B vitamin that is found commonly in many foods. However, it is also sold in like supplement stores, and it's actually sometimes marketed as a beauty supplement because of its alleged benefit in promoting hair and nail regrowth. And of course, there's a correlation there because your nails, like your hair, are also made out of keratin. And yeah, interestingly enough, biotin is important for hair growth. However, its use as a hair loss remedy is pretty misleading because, a lack of biotin can indeed cause hair loss, but it has to be a very severe deficiency. I'm talking about starving to death. And as such, biotin deficiencies are not very common outside of the third world, the developing world. So, I mean, it's something that most people who are watching this video probably will not have to worry about. And even if it is something that concerns you, you can easily eat more biotin-rich foods like cauliflower. Like most vegetables contain biotin, so I'm talking about things like cauliflower, broccoli, spinach, sweet potatoes, mushrooms, yams, white potatoes, mustard greens. Most vegetables, as well as a lot of fruits, will contain biotin. There's a few animal products that contain biotin as well, but I'm a vegan, so I'm not going to disclose those because that would be against my ethical beliefs. So, anyways, further talk of going on further about biotin. Biotin is a water soluble vitamin, so some people might think, all right, maybe I'm not deficient in biotin, but what if I got my biotin levels really, really high? Will that promote hair growth? And the answer is probably not because biotin is a water soluble vitamin. So you're not going to like have it build up in your adipose tissue like a fat soluble vitamin like vitamin A, which is extremely dangerous, by the way. I do not recommend megadosing vitamin A because it is poisonous at high doses. But if you are megadosing biotin, let's say you're taking like 200 times the amount you need per day, it's just going to pass through your system and you're just going to piss it out. So even if biotin supplementation does have benefits, the chances that your hair loss is caused by biotin and not androgens like DHT, as is typical with male pattern baldness, are very, very unlikely. Like, those advertisements you see on porn websites that say there are local women in your area looking to hook up. I mean, the chance of those being real are more likely than the chances of biotin being the reason why you're losing hair. So I really would not worry too much about biotin. So, anyways, okay, so let's move on to the next subject. And this is one I'm going to have to struggle not to rant about because it's something that drives me crazy. And it pisses me off because it shows just how so many people have no critical thinking skills whatsoever, that they show no skepticism behind all the dubious claims made about this product, and that is bone broth. So bone broth is a type of collagen supplementation, and collagen supplementation in recent years has become a worldwide scam. You see it being promoted by hipster idiots, the guys with man buns who walk around big cities, and they'll spend $8 for an 8-ounce cup of bone broth. And it's also popular with yoga moms who spend all day at home while their husbands work, and they'll spend a lot of their free time on social media platforms like YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and they'll see the product being promoted by a lot of pretty people. And since they're pretty, they won't even question any of the dubious claims that they make. And it's funny that it's promoted as a hair loss treatment because it's made out of collagen, and our hair isn't even made out of collagen. It's made out of keratin. I mean, not that it would matter, because the idea that consuming collagen will increase collagen production in the body isn't backed by any evidence-based research whatsoever. Collagen is what our tendons are made out of, and it's also an important component of binding our skin together. So it's important for skin health. And as we age, collagen production starts to decrease a little bit, especially after the age of 28. So maintaining collagen production and maintaining collagen to the skin is an appealing concept, and it's something that's popular. It's a popular subject in the anti-aging community, but the idea that we can just drink chicken stock and become immortal is just a fallacy. It's something that's not true. But the idea behind it is so appealing. It's easy to see why it's become so popular with a lot of bimbos and hipsters who shop at Whole Foods, because it tells them what they want to hear. And charlatans, scam artists, grifters, they know that people are much less likely to question their lies if they tell them something that confirms their biases. But the reality is that consuming collagen will just cause it to break down into amino acids in the gut, just like any other food. and we'll use the amino acids to fuel our body. So what do you do if you really want to improve collagen production in the body? The best thing to do is to eat a diet that's rich in fruit and vegetables. Eating a diet that's rich in fruit and vegetables, particularly green leafy greens, has been proven to increase collagen production in the skin where you want it. And additionally, if you want to go the unnatural route, you can try things like topical skin creams like retinoids. Like an example would be Retin-A or Tazorac. The latter is very expensive. I'd probably recommend just Retin-A because they've been shown to improve collagen production of the skin as well. And, that's great. So that's where you want the collagen. But putting collagen in the gut is not going to magically transport it to the skin. And it certainly isn't going to do anything for the hair either. And, additionally, the few vitamins and enzymes that are in bone broth get broken down when the bone broth is processed from the marrow. And the few studies that do show any kind of benefit from bone broth have been examined to show that the benefits actually didn't even come from the bone broth. They came from the vegetables that were cooked with them and not the broth. And furthermore, oftentimes bone broth is contaminated with heavy metals. So, that can cause its own host of health problems. But, if what I'm saying isn't convincing you, if you still want to try bone broth, then, don't fall for the overpriced supplement. If you're really insistent, just go buy some Jello. And if you're worried about the sugar content, you can just buy sugar-free Jello. It's the exact same crap, except maybe it's 1/30th the price. So if you're going to be ripped off, you may be ripped off for less rather than more. So, I know some keto people are going to watch this and they're going to be angry because, they treat this worthless crap like it's the fountain of youth. And, I fully expect that because, this is the internet we're living on, and on the internet, bad is good and good is bad. And when you give every idiot in the world to spread their BS misinformation and to impressionable idiots, you wind up with half the population thinking that putting a tablespoon of butter in your coffee with bone broth in the morning will count as a healthy breakfast. But if you eat something like blueberries and oatmeal in the morning, it's going to kill you because, the carbs are so bad. So if people want to think that, I'll just let them be. I'm not even going to bother trying to convince them. That's fine. They can do what they want. And, I know there's nothing I can do for them. So there really isn't much more I can say about bone broth. I mean, there actually is a lot more, but there isn't very much I can say that hasn't already been enunciated and elaborated on better by other people. So I'm just going to go ahead and link a really good, really funny article about bone broth and why it's such a complete scam in the description below. And if you guys want to, you can go ahead and read that. And I just want to do that because, I'm getting a little bit off topic here. So I just want to get back to what I was talking about. So anyways, another thing I want to talk about is the blood flow theory and the use of scalp massages and supplements that improve blood flow, as well as stupid devices like the Jazzercise, which is like you probably saw it advertised on YouTube last year. It's like a ball gag you put in your mouth, and the idea is by chomping on it, you're going to improve blood flow to the scalp. And just the concept that improving blood flow to the scalp is somehow going to improve hair growth or stop hair loss. It's complete nonsense. And the reason why is because if that were actually true, then we know that hypertension would cause hair loss. And I don't think I need to explain to you guys that there are plenty of people who are the absolute epitome of good health, who exercise regularly, who have an impeccable diet, yet they're still completely bald. And conversely, there are people who have absolute terrible health. They're like overweight, they smoke, they drink, they never exercise, and they still have full heads of hair. And that's because the blood flow has nothing to do with hair loss. And, a lot of people will come to this conclusion that blood flow is somehow linked to hair growth because minoxidil, its original use was that of an antihypertensive drug. So a lot of people jump to the conclusion that the reason why minoxidil works is because it improves blood flow to the scalp. But that's actually not true. We don't really understand the mechanism behind minoxidil. We just know that it promotes the growth of the dermal papilla cells, and it causes them to grow, and those are the cells that DHT is trying to destroy. We don't know exactly how it happens or why it happens. It was just kind of an accidental side effect that was discovered with the original oral drug, which is Lonatin. But we know it's not the actual blood flow thing, and there's nothing more to say about that because it's pretty obvious that it's androgens that cause hair loss. I mean, there's a good reason why most people who lose hair are men. And if you think that there's like some big secret behind hair loss that goes beyond androgens, then you're just setting yourself up for failure. So it's best to stick with the conventional treatments and not just like jump to the conclusion that there's some theoretical cause of your hair loss that's beyond what affects 99% of individuals. So that's all I wanted to talk about as far as hair loss treatments that I think are scam. But there is one hair loss treatment I want to talk about that I'm not quite sure about, but I get asked about a lot. And that's called PRP, which is platelet rich plasma. And I didn't want to cast judgment on this one way or another because, simply put, I don't know enough about it. But having done some research on it, this is a treatment that I know has been used successfully by orthopedic doctors to treat sport related injuries to the joints, tendons, and ligaments, as well as injuries to connective tissue through wear and tear, just as a result of aging and just, as our lifestyle. So, it works in a pretty weird way. The way it's done is that it's performed by putting blood, your own blood, in a centrifuge, or a blood of the patient in in a centrifuge, and a centrifuge will work to separate the components of the blood, and then the clinician, the doctor, will extract the platelets, which allegedly contain growth factors, which can heal the affected tissue. So we know that DHT slows down the growth of the dermal papilla cells, but it actually does it by damaging and then eventually outright destroying the hair follicles. So the theory behind PRP is that it can actually be used to help restore damage to the hair follicles. So, it might work. There was actually a 2019 systemic review that showed that it was 19 different studies with 460 total participants that yielded positive results. And that's nothing to sneeze at. That's pretty substantial right there. However, it was also followed up and it was showed that there were some issues with the study as different researchers would use different methods of application regarding, and also with different session durations and injection sites, which may have adversely affected the reliability of the study. But that could be because, it's just a new treatment and not everybody does it the same way. And that doesn't mean the study is bogus. It just means that it needs further review. And furthermore, since the treatment is new, like I said, it's possible that many doctors may not be as experienced as others, which could affect the treatment of the quality of the treatment. And I would compare it to, like, getting a hair transplant in the 1980s, back when the procedure was less than a generation old, and many doctors just had not spent enough time perfecting the medical art, which is what a hair transplant absolutely is. It's a medical art. So maybe it works, but even if it does work, maybe give it a little bit more time for more clinical trials to come in and for doctors to actually just perfect their skill, especially since it's pretty expensive. So, maybe it's worth a try if you're feeling adventurous. But for me, I prefer to stick with stuff that I know works. And that's why I always recommend to the people who are watching my videos, stick with the stuff that we know works because, I say it all. I know I sound like a broken record here, but, time is of the essence. You don't want to experiment with stuff that may not work because, if you're using it, then you lose your hair, then you may not be able to regrow that back once you actually do get on treatment. And that's exactly what happened to me. And, that's ultimately what I'm doing with these videos, that I'm just relaying my own personal experience. And one of the things I regret is that I didn't just start on finasteride from day one, because that's the drug that has been giving me the best results over the 10 plus years that I've been fighting male pattern baldness. It's something that I know works. Not just because it works for me, because of the mountains and tens of millions of dollars worth of research behind it. And I know it's a safe treatment, it's a convenient treatment, and it's really still, to this day, the gold standard in treatment for male pattern baldness. Maybe that will change when Brizola, which is also known as CB0301, finishes phase 3 clinical trials for male pattern baldness. It'll probably be approved as an acne treatment first. But for the time being, at least, stick with finasteride. And, if you're worried about side effects, you can do a lower dose, like a quarter of a milligram, half a milligram, even every other day treatment. It still is almost as effective, and it will work for the overwhelming majority of people who are fighting male pattern baldness. And usually when someone says it doesn't work, it's usually because they're panicking over initial shed, or they just didn't give it enough time to work. They didn't give it at least 6 months, which is recommended for any new treatment that you start. So anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about regarding treatments that I think are bogus. I've spent a lot of time talking about treatments that I work, so I figured I'd create at least one video going over the stuff that I don't think works. So I hope you guys found it informative, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.